Usually the most difficult part of proving genocide is intent, because there has to be an intention to destroy in whole or in part a particular group. In this case, the intent by Israeli leaders has been so explicitly stated and publicly stated by the Prime Minister, by the President, by senior cabinet ministers, by military leaders, that that is an easy case to make. It's on the public record. But it's important that we start using the language that the law sets out. Just as in recent terms, every major international human rights organization, Israeli human rights organizations, Palestinian human rights organizations, United Nations human rights mechanisms, independent mechanisms, have found that the situation in Israel and Palestine amounts to the crime of apartheid. And I feel quite confident as a human rights lawyer in saying that what I see unfolding in Gaza and beyond is genocide.
Following the founding of Israel on stolen land and the subsequent nearly century-long occupation, Palestinian resistance movements have raised valiant efforts to fight back in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The recent developments are only the latest episode in the long road to liberation for the Palestinian people. But how did all this start? In this video, we'll discuss the origin of the Israel-Palestine conflict, its development, the crimes of the Israeli apartheid regime, and the future of the resistance which is integral to the nationhood of the Palestinian people. If you enjoy what we do, then don't forget to like the video, and check out our Patreon for exclusive content and early releases. Parallel with the development of European anti-Semitism, the world saw the emergence of the political Zionism movement, a project with the goal of establishing a homeland for the Jewish people, specifically in Palestine, though options from Africa to Latin America, all inhabited by other peoples, were considered. Over the decades leading up to 1948, Zionist political groups managed to secure support in high places, particularly among the British, who expressed in the Balfour Declaration an effort to help the, quote, establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. As the brutality of fascism ravaged Europe and beyond, more impetus was driven into the Zionist movement, which won support from other major powers, resulting in the violent founding of the State of Israel in 1948. Israel, from its very foundation, even according to its original architects, was a settler colonial nation, meaning it's based on, quote, an ongoing system of power that perpetuates the genocide and repression of indigenous peoples and cultures. This involves the movement of a majority European population into the land of Palestine, the displacement, killing, and expulsion of indigenous Palestinians, and the forceful seizure of their homes and lands. This colonization of Palestine has been systemic and targeted, with the express purpose of eliminating the Palestinian presence within their borders through displacement, institutional denial of basic rights, denial of access to farming land or water resources, and mass imprisonment and surveillance. This has been termed an incremental genocide by human rights lawyers, with zero consequences for the Israeli state. Though genocide is an overused term in general political discourse, the actions of Israel are about as clear as it gets. To quote a now former top UN official who recently resigned over the issue, this is a textbook case of genocide. But what exactly does this genocide look like? Prior to 1948, mass migration by European Jews into Palestine was an ongoing process. On November 29, 1947, Resolution 181 was adopted by the UN, with no legal authority and no consultation with the Palestinians who actually owned and lived in the land of Palestine. This resolution recommended the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, which made little sense, as the European Jews who had recently moved into Palestine only constituted 1/3 of the population, and owned less than 6% of the total land area. The UN plan, however, gave this recently migrated population 55% of the land, including many major cities with Arab majorities, important farmland, ports, and the coastline from Haifa to Jaffa. Unsurprisingly, Palestinians rejected this proposal, and war broke out. Between 1947 and 1949, at least 750,000 Palestinians from a population of 1.9 million were made refugees beyond the borders of the state. Zionist forces had taken more than 78% of historic Palestine, ethnically cleansed and destroyed about 530 villages and cities, and killed about 15,000 Palestinians in a series of mass atrocities, including more than 70 massacres. This is known as the Nakba, or catastrophe. This systematic dispossession was immediately enshrined into Israeli law, with one simple example being Palestinians forcibly evicted from their land, or those turned into refugees, being termed absentee, making the Israeli state seizure of all their property, land, and bank accounts legal and mandatory. Since then, Israel has illegally expanded into the rest of Palestine despite condemnations by the UN, the vast majority of the international community, and countless human rights organizations. Palestinian homes are regularly and illegally demolished. Palestinians face arbitrary arrests and humiliating checkpoints just getting to school and back. Entire villages are ethnically cleansed specifically for recently migrated European and American Jews to build new illegal settlements on Palestinian land. Again, these settlements are internationally recognized as illegal by international law, and this point is reiterated at every UN summit to no meaningful change. The Gaza Strip, populated by over 2 million people in an area about the size of Detroit, is entirely cut off from the rest of the world. All entrances in and out of Gaza are controlled by the Israeli military. Imports and exports are heavily restricted, and employment opportunities are essentially non-existent. 97% of all water sources are undrinkable by design, and civilian infrastructure is regularly targeted by Israeli airstrikes. Permits are routinely denied for the building of homes, civilian infrastructure, roads, sewage systems, and schools. Even within Israel proper, where a sizable Arab minority resides, dozens of laws exist which discriminate against this involuntary Arab minority in a clearly apartheid system recognized as such by organizations the world over, especially the nation of South Africa, which experienced apartheid firsthand. Any objective review of Israel's legal system clearly shows an enshrined and institutional push for racial supremacy of Jews and the exclusion of indigenous Palestinians. Recent developments include the surprise operation launched by a coalition of Palestinian armed groups against Israel on the 7th of October 2023, as a result of repeated Israeli aggression and damage to the Al-Aqsa Mosque complex and the worshippers within it. Through a rudimentary air, sea, and land assault, these volunteer Palestinian forces achieved unprecedented victories against Israel all across the border zone between the Gaza Strip and the rest of occupied Palestine, catching the Zionist security forces by surprise and proving yet again that Israel's supposed invincibility, funded by US dollars, is a myth. Though by no means a full-scale attempt at retaking all of Palestine, this operation proves to the world that the illegal Israeli occupation prevents any semblance of normalcy in the region until the Palestinians achieve peace and justice. For the first time in decades, the walls and barbed wire of the world's largest concentration camp were ripped open, allowing an oppressed population to take their liberation into their own hands. The average age in Gaza is just 18, and for many, this was the first time outside the walls of their open-air prison. The operation has elicited immediate solidarity with Palestine among the bulk of the international community, though the EU and the US just last month lauding Ukraine for resisting the occupation of its land through armed resistance, threw all their weight behind Israel to protect the interests of capital and their business in the region. This stands in stark contrast to the vast majority of the global population, which has come out in solidarity with Palestinians as marches and rallies have taken place in practically every capital on the globe. Another victory for the operation was Palestine managing to throw a wrench in the criminal attempts at normalization with Israel by neighboring nations, in particular Saudi Arabia. These neighboring countries have, by and large, come out with statements condemning the apartheid regime for their clear attempt at genocide. Taking all this into consideration, this long history of conflict, apartheid, and geopolitical intrigue, what does the future look like? For Israel, this October operation has already allowed for the temporary reconciliation of deeply fractured and divided political and social forces within the regime, and given new life to the political standing of arguably the most unpopular Israeli leader yet, Netanyahu. Long known as Mr. Security for supposedly protecting regular Israelis, the events of October are seen as a major failing of his administration, and another blow to his rapidly declining support. Seeking legitimacy and towing the line of the political faction he serves, Netanyahu will milk the terror narrative for as long as he can while carrying out the usual mass killing of civilians Israel is known for. Israel's war minister reproduced fascist talking points by saying, quote, "I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals, and we act accordingly." The collective punishment has continued with the cutting off of all communications within Gaza to prevent the sharing of Israeli atrocities on social media, a major PR disaster for Israel that has reached new heights since the beginning of the month. Relentless bombing has resulted in the destruction of Gaza's only power plant, the obliteration of entire neighborhoods, the targeting of ambulances and hospitals, mosques and churches, sanitation centers, refugee camps, civilians, journalists, and UN staff. The Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor, a non-profit organization, reports, quote, Israeli forces are mass killing civilians in the Gaza Strip. Within a few hours of a single night, Israeli armed forces killed approximately 70 children inside their homes. In the form of retaliation and collective punishment, Israeli forces deliberately target civilian objects to inflict widespread casualties and destruction, including material and human losses. This violates international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions, and amounts to a war crime under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Unsurprisingly, the West, which pretends to care deeply for humanitarianism when it suits them, has turned a blind eye, instead solely declaring solidarity with Israel, committing funds and weapons for the occupation war machine, and refusing to report on Israeli war crimes. The EU even suspended all aid to Palestine, a decision reversed only after a global outcry and diplomatic intervention. Now, the EU makes do by passing anti-public disturbance declarations, which seem to solely result in the arrest and harassment of those with pro-Palestinian sentiment. Israel, taking advantage of this overwhelming support from the Western centers of capital, has launched its media offensive, which Western reporting reproduces with zero investigation, resulting in wild propagandistic claims with no basis in reality. At the time of writing, not one single claim of atrocities supposedly committed by Palestinians as reported by Israel have turned out to be true. At the same time, there is next to zero mainstream coverage of Israel's indiscriminate killing of children, targeting of healthcare staff, journalists, and clinics, or destruction of civilian infrastructure. The UN has reported that it's been forced to close all 14 food distribution centers in Gaza, which leaves 500,000 people without vital food aid in the besieged strip. Despite all this suffering, the Palestinian people remain steadfast in their commitment to existing on their own land, defying the unending calls for genocide emanating from the Israeli political establishment. For Palestine, the many captives they have taken may be useful in prisoner swaps and other concessions, and the pausing of normalization efforts with Israel among neighboring countries further stunt Israeli efforts at an unjust normalcy in the region. Aside from this, however, the long-term positive results from recent events remain unclear beyond dispelling Israeli arrogance about the invincibility of its occupation. To besiege a people locked in a concentration camp and tell them not to fight back is to condemn them to take part in their own genocide. Put yourself in their shoes and think about what you would do. Palestinian liberation isn't a question of if, but when. The only question that remains is whether the supposedly free and democratic nations of the West will be on the right side of history, as the rest of the world already is. Refer to decolonizepalestine.com to learn more about Palestine and the conflict, and be sure to read the books you see on screen for a fuller understanding. If you appreciate the work we're doing here at First Thought, consider supporting us on Patreon so we can grow and expand.